Welcome to From Global to Grounded, Climate Commitments in Action. My name is Tamina Lalani Sharif. I'm a Managing Director of Climate, Health and Development here at GHV. And I'm really thrilled that all of you could join us for what promises to be a really interesting conversation today. This webinar is actually the third in a series that GHV hosts several times a year. Through these gatherings, what we're aiming to do is to connect experts in the public, private, and also in the nonprofit sectors around the globe to explore cross-sectoral issues that we're actively working on, and also to advance really vital conversations in the health and development fields. And you can learn more about us if you're interested on our website. So today is June 3rd. And in a few weeks, hundreds of people will be gathering in Bonn for the mid-year climate conference under the UNFCCC. And this year in particular, parties will make important decisions to move the global goal on adaptation from concept to action. And we're really lucky that our moderator will tell us a little bit more about that in a moment. But as we prepare for the Bonn meetings, we're interested today in exploring what it actually takes to turn global agreements into grounded action, and how lessons from past processes could potentially help us strengthen implementation and also accountability moving forward. So we're really honored today to have a panel of incredibly knowledgeable speakers with a wide variety of experience in the field. If you're interested, please see the link in the chat for their bios. And I'm going to now introduce our moderator, who will frame our conversation, and then introduce our panelists. After the panel, we're aiming to have about 15 minutes for Q&A. But, I know how webinars go, and usually your questions come pretty fast and furious. So please feel free to add them in the chat as they occur during the webinar. We really want to try and make this as inclusive and as interactive as possible. So please go ahead and add them as they occur to you. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Cristina Rumbaitis del Rio. Cristina has nearly 20 years of experience developing and implementing climate change adaptation and resilience programs. She currently serves as the Senior Advisor for Adaptation and Resilience at the United Nations Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you, Cristina.
Thank you so much, Tamina, and thank you for the opportunity to have this panel here today. It's a great opportunity just on the eve of the mid-year climate negotiations to check in on what's going on with climate adaptation and climate resilience. And, those are the terms we tend to use within the negotiations. But as someone was telling me a few weeks ago, an investor was saying, you shouldn't talk about it as adaptation or resilience, because that, what is that? What does it mean? You should just talk about it as reality. It's climate reality. People are facing impacts everywhere across the world today. And the fact of the matter is we need to respond to it, and we need to respond to that in many different ways. And so a lot of the international negotiations, the climate COP process, as it's called, the Conference of Parties, is a lot of it is focused on really the issue of curbing greenhouse gas emissions to limit global warming. But as I said, the climate reality is that impacts are already happening today and are locked into our climate system and will continue to happen for years to come. And so we need to really scale up our efforts and the level of action that we have on adaptation so that everyone can have safe, healthy, prosperous lives, even in the face of more frequent and more severe climate impacts. So that's really what we're here to talk about. Progress has been slow, very small scale and fragmented, and those are the last IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that really was a rallying cry for greater action. So to respond to this, a few years ago, actually going back 15 years ago, the Paris Agreement established a global goal on adaptation to really put adaptation on the same footing as mitigation or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and keeping emissions to no more than 1.5 degrees of warming. The global goal on adaptation seeks to improve adaptive capacity, enhance resilience, and reduce climate vulnerability to the adverse effects of climate change. But that's really, really high level. And so what does it actually mean? What does it look like? And to respond to that challenge, 2 years ago, the global community came together at a COP meeting in Dubai and agreed on something called the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience. And that's what's on the slide that you're seeing there. There are several key themes, thematic aspects that and targets, quantitative targets that were agreed to that relate to food, water and agriculture, health, ecosystems, biodiversity, poverty and livelihoods, infrastructure, and even cultural heritage, as specific areas where we need to scale up our efforts in having more climate resilient health systems, for instance, or more climate resilience, water and sanitation. The next slide shows you a set of 4 additional targets that were agreed to in 2023 that relate to what we call the adaptation policy cycle. That's the idea that you need to first analyze your risks, understand climate risks and vulnerabilities, plan to address those risks, obviously implement those plans, and then monitor, evaluate, and learn throughout the process. It's not a linear process. And countries are at various stages of this in various sectors. And so this framework was articulated in 2023. The past 2 years, there's been a focus on developing indicators to actually measure progress and how we're achieving where we are. Are we moving the needle? Are we not? Why not? Where not? As part of ratcheting ambition under the Paris Agreement. And so this is a commitment that countries have made to take adaptation more seriously and with greater urgency, to conduct risk assessments and address climate hazards and the risk exposure, to mobilize resources, to collaborate, and to really work across a number of different mainstreaming adaptation across a number of different sectoral aspects. And so, as I mentioned, this year beginning last year, there's been a lot of work done by a set of technical experts to develop indicators, and they've managed to narrow down the list from about, I think, 7,000 indicators to a few weeks ago, a shortened compilation of indicators, which was only 450 indicators long, was released. That needs to be shortened down further, and part of what we'll be discussing in Bonn is where are we on these indicators, how do we shorten them further, and then how do we advance really on the implementation. We've brought a really diverse set of speakers together that we can learn from, working on various different aspects, different levels of adaptation issues. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today, to hear really from them what they see as the opportunity space and the changes that are needed by the global community to really make progress on adaptation action. We'll hear from Maha Al-Zu'bi, who's a regional researcher on sustainable and resilient water systems at the International Water Management Institute. We'll hear from Dan Gilligan, who's the director of the Poverty and Gender Inclusion Unit at IFPRI, I just went on the acronym. You're going to tell us, Dan, what the acronym stands for. Food Policy Research Institute, International Food Policy Research Institute, both part of, with IMI, GIAR. Lina Yassin, who's a climate policy researcher at IIED and also a climate negotiator, an adaptation negotiator. And Mustafa, who is a senior agricultural economist at the World Bank Group. So we'll hear lots of different perspectives, from research perspectives, advocacy, country perspectives, finance perspectives during this panel. I do want to invite those joining at home to contribute questions as you think of them. Don't wait for the Q&A section. We will have plenty of time for Q&A, but as you think of questions, please do put them in the chat, and we'll try to respond to as many of these as we can. Lena, I want to start with you. You've been very deeply involved in the global goal on adaptation and this whole indicator process and the development of targets before that. But also on the issue of locally led adaptation and how adaptation gets down to the local level. Your institution has worked a lot on that through the years, and you represent the least developed countries group in negotiations. From your perspective, are these global frameworks actually helping countries to make the sorts of decisions and prioritizations that are needed to support communities in adapting to climate change? And why or why not? And what further changes are needed to really drive more useful and more useful policies and more impact on the ground?
Thanks a lot, Christina, and thanks also to Global Health Visions for bringing us together for this really important and key conversation, also timely given that some of us, myself, will be heading to Bonn in a few days, and that's where a lot of key decisions will be made. Christina, your question on the global frameworks and locally-led adaptation, I do want to begin by saying I come from Sudan. Sudan is least developed countries, and in my job, I'm privileged to be working with the whole group of the least developed countries. That involves working directly with ministers, governments, but also national and subnational actors. And I can tell you, these are the countries, and from a personal experience, these are the countries that don't have the privilege to choose whether to adapt or not. We have to. In Sudan, Sudan is a very religious country. When I growing up, people used to pray for no floods or like a year with no floods, a year with no death and damage. And now people pray for less damage. We've accepted the fact that floods are gonna happen this year, but we just pray that less people will die. This is the reality that a lot of countries live through. And this is what we need to remind ourselves. Christina, when you started, you did say that. You said that we need to stop saying resilience, adaptation. We need to talk about the fact that these are stories. So I do have a lot to say about global frameworks, and especially because I am at the global level. And that global level is very detached. I promise you, we stay in rooms up until 2 a.m. and not one single human story will be mentioned throughout the day when we're negotiating adaptation. So that's the sad part where we see the detachment between global level and national level. But it's not all bad. The global goal on adaptation was a very critical step. It's a step that elevated adaptation, gave it the political visibility that it needs. And it was also a commitment to locally led adaptation. And this is really key for the least developed countries because, like I said, climate risks are immediate and adaptation is in least developed countries is deeply tied to local knowledge and governance. So let me start with the good news. The good news is the GGA and the framework that Cristina just wonderfully presented gave us structure. It showed us a way where we can make sense of what is the global goal on adaptation and make sense of where we're heading. Are we heading in the right direction? Are intervention needed? And if interventions are needed, where exactly? Where is the gap? Is it on health? Is it on agriculture? These are questions that we didn't have the answer to. And hopefully through this framework, we will have the answer to. And another good news is countries are actively working on adaptation. The LDC group actually has one of the highest success rates on national adaptation plans. More than half of the group has national adaptation plans in place, and the other half is actively working on submitting one and are in very advanced stages already. So the commitment and the action at a national level is there. But there is a disconnect still between the planning and the actual implementation capacity at a community level. So I'm going to try and be brief, but I do want to point out three challenges with global framework. First of all, finance remains misaligned. Actually, right now, less than 10% of climate finance reaches local level actors directly. So this is a big gap. If we're gonna adapt, we need to make sure those who are actively adapting and the ones who know what's going on, the ones who are living through it, are the ones being supported and provided the finance. Another thing on finance that is crucial is that majority of adaptation finance still takes form in loans and large grants with complex reporting standards. So I can promise you that sometimes, and having worked with the ministry in Sudan, um, there are a lot of proposals that we didn't submit to the GCF just because of how much work we needed to. And I promise you, we needed the money, but it's the amount of work and amount of assessments that you had to go through just to access the funding, which goes beyond the capacity of a lot of the least developed countries. Another issue is, and this is something right now that we see with the indicators and the indicators that are being discussed, those 400 something indicators, most of them are measurements that are disconnected from context. And this is something we need to answer in bond. How do we make sure those indicators that we're debating and negotiating actually reflect lived realities? Because local actors are the ones adaptive. They're the ones doing informal seed systems, water sharing arrangements. They're the ones using indigenous knowledge. But the current indicators don't all capture that. So we need to make sure these things are truly captured and reflected. And we need to talk about the fact that power still remains centralized, the fact that these frameworks are still at the top level. And the sad part is most of adaptation happens at a district or community level, but funding and policy conversations in the UNFCCC right now, we only talk about national level. So how do we make sure local actors are truly engaged in this conversation? We acknowledge them. We say, oh, local communities and indigenous people are important to be considered, but we never truly action that part. So we need to think about this. And then I'll finish by saying, what do we need? What's needed? A lot of people think this is radical, but I really don't think so. And international reform of climate finance is needed. We need to support direct access. I don't think we should not be labeling these things at direct as radical, because we've seen how the current financial mechanism is not serving the communities. It's not serving those who need it the most. So we need to think about a fit for purpose, small grant mechanisms, devolved funds, and national systems that actually enable subnational actors to lead and be the ones adapting. We also need to think about a political shift, one that treats local adaptation as a governance principle, not as a tick box. You don't tick box local adaptation, you implement it, you do it, you live it. So changing the perspective and the narrative at a political level is going to be really key. And this year, with Brazil being the presidency championing adaptation, I cannot think of a better time where we can elevate locally led adaptation and actually live it and promote it and champion it. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lena. So many great points there. But I also appreciate that you started with personal story, and I hope that we can get grounded in this conversation. I know that we will, with the experience that we have here. I want to go next to Daniel. You're an agricultural economist. You've done extensive research on social protection, agriculture, nutrition, all very key issues at the heart of the global goal on adaptation. Sticking with the local theme, from your perspective, going from the global to the local, do these global policies and funding priorities really reflect what local communities are dealing with respect to climate change in their daily lives? And how could these agreements bring better focus to help scale the solutions that are needed to reach more people from your perspective?
Great. Thanks, Christina. It's a great question. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to emphasize first just that governments, donors, I'm thinking of the multilateral development banks and foundations, private sector, really have to stay the course on investment in the climate adaptation agenda. So there's a weakening of support across many places, and in many senses a need for kind of strengthening of the commitments. And so just really kind of highlighting that need at the highest levels, and these global agreements are key for that. But then, yes, we have to get right down to kind of working at the local level to how to actually improve adaptation. A focus that I want to make is that global agreements and kind of all the work that's happening behind them and below them really have to keep a focus on the poor. So, and I appreciate Lena's comments on sort of keeping this people focused. When we do that, the negative effects of climate risk and climate shocks are disproportionately going to affect poor communities and poor households. So what type of responses can we consider? Well, certainly social protection programs, they're widespread. All countries have them. In many cases, there's very large and robust national programs, and they can play a really key role here. But the design features are critical to shaping the success of those programs to help on climate adaptation. And then also generally working across complementary components, bringing in other dimensions, not just, for example, cash transfers, but complementary components to help on investment in agriculture, water reclamation, for example. In general, the same things that kind of help build well-functioning societies, high quality public service delivery, well-functioning markets. These are the same things that help communities and households adapt. And so those investments need to continue. And then I just want to add that climate adaptation efforts could learn from the successes of the nutrition community in building broad support and action to improve awareness, evidence, funding, and action. There's been a lot of success there in the nutrition community of really adding awareness, bringing super high quality evidence to what works, and then building those communities among civil society, within governments, researchers, donors, to really get a positive kind of groundswell of effort. This is happening, of course, in climate, but I think more could be learned from the nutrition community about how to sort of really get a lot of momentum behind that. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great points. We do need that groundswell of effort. We should be learning lessons from nutrition and everywhere else that has valuable lessons to offer. I want to turn next to Maha. You've worked a lot in the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, which faces enormous climate risks, extreme heat, drought, water scarcity, and have done some really innovative research, the water energy food nexus, which is a cross-cutting issue and really looking across these different domains, which even in the GGA framework are in slightly different targets and slightly different boxes. Why is this sort of cross-sector thinking so important for climate resilience? And again, how do we accelerate action and improve action from your point of view? And Dan gave us the laser focus on poverty in particular.
Thank you so much, Cristina. This is a very important question, and thanks for Global Health Vision for this opportunity. So cross-sector integration is not just a technical ideal, it's a global necessity. So the impact of climate change are interconnected, and so must be our responses. So the global goal in adaptation, as just you mentioned, and other colleagues here, it calls for strengthening the resilience across systems like water, food, and infrastructure. But these systems do not function in silos, so it is all connected. So let me give like just an example from like globally, like South Asia extended droughts strain both agriculture yields and let's say hydropower capacity. So while increased demand for groundwater pumping raise energy use. So if adaptation policies only address one sector, say water conservation, but ignore energy access or food production, the intervention fall short. Another example, I guess this is globally and still applicable for MENA and maybe for Jordan as well, we have seen how wastewater reuse policies require cooperation between water, agriculture, health sectors. But in practice, these ministries often have either a conflicting mandates or operate on different timelines or lack shared data platforms. So for an example, if a new wastewater treatment to be built, but local farmers are not equipped or authorized to use the treated wastewater in agriculture because, like, for example, agriculture guidelines were not aligned. So that means there is a need for cooperation between these ministries. Similarly, when we are talking about like a climate finance, so many adaptation funds still operate in single sector silos. So for instance, a fund might support solar irrigation, but not cover farmer training, groundwater monitoring, coordinating with national water strategies. So all of which are essential for long-term resilience. So what's still holding us back is twofold. Like first, institutional fragmentation. Ministries often operate under different mandates, timelines, data system, which makes coordination and planning very difficult, or coordinated planning very difficult. Second, our climate finance and the project design tools still favor sector-specific outcomes. So these That means a water project might not factor into food or energy impact, missing a huge opportunity for co-benefits. So to overcome this, we need like policies and funding mechanisms that require multi-sector collaboration by design, not just as a nice to have. Yeah, I will stop here, and thank you.
Thanks. So we need that multi-sector collaboration by design from the get-go. And I think you partially addressed the question that someone that Rahima asked in the chat about SDGs and how working across silos. But feel free to add more if you have more to, or if anyone wants to add more to the question that was asked about working across silos. Iftikhar, I want to come to you next. So Dan said donors need to stay the course. We need to deal with this reality. You've worked across many fragile and climate exposed countries in your career, designing irrigation and water smart agriculture programs. Innovations that can really improve climate resilience in rural communities and reduce water stress in this food, water, energy nexus. From your point of view, what's missing when it comes to scaling climate resilient agriculture and water smart agriculture? What is needed to really get to that much higher scale of action, especially in places facing both conflict and extreme climate risks?
Thank you, Cristina, and hi to everyone who is watching. And also thank you to the Global Health Vision for this organizing this webinar. Let me just start recalling an incident that happened a couple of years back. I was traveling in Southeast Asian country for a project. And as we were traveling on the road, I noticed that in one of the farms, there was a sign there which said, "No farmers, no farms, no food, no future." And it took me a while to really appreciate what the farmer was saying. And I think in our discussion today, in various ways, this was coming up. And even when I was looking at your slides, Cristina, one thing that is common among those, the first slide in particular, common among those pictures was the human face, the people. In each and every one of them, the common factor is the people. So I think, and it has already been mentioned, it is critical that we start the conversation, we start the discussion, focusing on who is it for? Why are we doing this? I mean, is this just an exercise of intellectual exercise, or is it really to solve a real problem or the real people? Having said that, the question you have asked, if one of the things I would say is a real integration of public-private producer partnership. Normally you hear about 3 Ps. I've added 1 P here. Public-private producers partnership. And it's very important to have this partnership because that's where you bring the government, you bring the private sector, you bring the farmers, civil society on the same platform and have an honest conversation. But unless and until you have that honest conversation, you'll always have what Lena was talking about, that in the rooms in UN or in Geneva or wherever it is, conversation will take place, but it will not have the true essence of, why are we doing this for? And I think once in a while, it's very important to remind people why we are doing that. The critical gap there, I think people have mentioned today about the finance. I would suggest that it is not just finance. Finance is an issue, but it is how we coordinate among the various players. That is important, or equally important. Coordination among the public-private sector, the producers. That coordination aspect is equally important as the funding bit of it. The other point I would like to mention, if you allow me, is I think it's important not just look at the strategy bit of it, but look at the strategy and to see how the strategy can be implemented, especially in these, in the unstable environments, to have robust execution mechanisms that can function in these various environments. And the final point I would like to make is that I think we need to move beyond isolated technical solutions to holistic approach. And that, again, that theme has been coming around, multi-sectoral approach and so on. And I think that is very important because without this multi-sectoral approach and holistic approach, we'll always have that silo. And that doesn't matter if it's the adaptation, if it is agriculture, wherever it is, we'll always face that issue there. So my final point to you is that we really need to have this holistic approach to address the issues and make people the center of our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Iftikhar. So people-centered, holistic approaches by design, creating those robust partnerships and grounding in the reality and implementing in the reality of the locations. I think some really clear messages across everyone's interventions today. I do want to remind people to put questions in the chat. We'll come to them. We have another round of questions, and I want us to get even more grounded if we can. And that means, again, taking this notion of the reality that people are facing, but also the reality that there are differences between men and women, and a gendered approach is very much needed. So I want to go to Daniel first, because a lot of your research has focused on gender equity in development programs and evaluations of social protection efforts, and who they reach and who they don't reach, and what's needed. So just to hear a little bit more from that experience of what worked and how can programs like cash transfers or nutrition support be better improved and deployed to support both men and women and sort of the climate resilience of both of those populations.
Yeah, great, Cristina. Thank you so much. I love talking about this. This is at the heart of our research at IFPRI. We work a lot on nutrition-sensitive and gender-sensitive cash transfer models. These are sometimes referred to as cash plus models, kind of testing what combinations of strategies make them most effective. And I'm going to share some results from two of our studies that I think are quite illustrative and sort of really can help our discussion here. The first is called the Transfer Modality Research Initiative in Bangladesh. This was a study that compared food and cash transfers with and without nutrition training. And this was a study that was done in 2012 to 2014, followed up in 3 successive rounds. So we're looking at, in some cases, longer term effects of this program. What we found, what my colleagues found, is that the cash and training, nutrition training together, that kind of treatment arm had really transformative effects for households, women, and children. For example, an improved child diets and nutritional status, leading to a nearly 8 percentage point reduction in stunting at the program after 2 years. It also improved women's livelihoods and home production of nutritious foods through livestock rearing and homestead gardening. 4 years after the program, as I said, we had gone back later, the program had led to sustained reduction in household poverty, and this effect actually operated through improvements in women's livelihoods. And then 8 years post-program, the combination of cash and nutrition training led to sustained reductions in intimate partner violence. This was really not expected initially at the start of the program, that essentially a poverty program of cash transfers combined with nutrition training could actually lead to reductions in intimate partner violence. But those results came out in the early rounds of study and actually were sustained 8 years later. So again, it's a combination of interventions, but including a gender-sensitive model. Then I'll just briefly talk about some results that we have from a large-scale study that we've done in Ethiopia called SPEAR. So we know that global warming increases the risk of extreme weather events like drought. So in Ethiopia, we examined the effects of an economic inclusion program called SPEAR that's linked to the government's large safety net called the Productive Safety Net Program. And we looked at the effects of the economic inclusion program in protecting households from the ill effects of local drought shocks. And in the time period that we were studying this, the drought shocks that occurred were relatively modest, essentially representing a typical year in Ethiopia at this point. So this was these were not particularly bad drought years, but common ones. So what we found is that even modest drought shocks significantly worsened household food security, livestock asset holdings, and actually increased the prevalence of intimate partner violence. And then we looked at what happens for households that received the economic inclusion program. So there we saw that all of these negative effects of drought were substantially reduced, if not eliminated, as a result of being in the program. And also that women in the economic inclusion program had improved diets and also better nutritional status. We also tested an approach of providing men a targeted curriculum around gender equity, training men in men's groups around how to sort of better engage in at-home work, and found that this changed both their beliefs and their practices for supporting traditionally female domestic tasks. So those are just some examples, but these were really highly effective programs that are operating at a very large scale, both in Bangladesh and Ethiopia. So I think and some important lessons from us that actual improvement in outcomes here is really possible. Okay, thanks.
Thanks for that. That's really useful. Great to see the evidence there, but also bundling. These are not, as we were saying, these are not single
Right.
solution sorts of issues. Fantastic to have that evidence. Maha, I want to turn to you next. Given you research on water, food, energy nexus issues at the household level, where you've looked at behavior, you've also looked at the gender dynamics happening within households in urban environments. I guess from your perspective, how do we need to operate and design projects to achieve the sorts of human security and inclusion impacts that for instance, that Dan was just talking about? What are some of the lessons you've drawn out of your research?
Thank you, Cristina. So that's a critical question. So too often, like a climate project focus on infrastructure delivery, like pipelines, treatment plants, irrigation canals, without fully considering who benefits and how. So, but climate resilience is not just about physical assets. It's about human security as well, like access to water, to food, to health, to energy, and a stable livelihood. So maybe one major shift we need is to design projects around people's lived realities. For example, my recent research in Jordan is just like an urban community, but a poor community where it could be like called like a hosting even a refugee community in Amman in Jordan, shows how householders, especially women, adapt in creative ways when formal systems somehow do not accommodate their needs. So women ration water, recycle grey water. They practice at household energy saving practices, food shopping strategies, when to cook, how much to spend on let's say shopping this material or that material, local manufactured or imported. So all of these thinking exist at household level. Even the research address even the governance, who say what at household, who has the power over money to purchase like energy saving appliances or water saving appliances. So results shows that when household is led by a male who bring the income, so he has the say over how to use the money. When women are working shared like income together, they have a better let's say decisions, like more joint decisions on what to purchase and what to do. So but these actions are invisible in many national adaptation plans. So we need inclusive design process, starting with community consultation, gender sensitive planning, mechanisms that allow local voices to shape both the risk that are prioritized and the solution that are funded. So we also need to pair infrastructure with service like maintenance, training, accountability. So in other words, build with not just for community. So a key shift we need is to move from infrastructure-led design to human-centered adaptation. Too many climate projects focus on what can be built, pipeline, treatment plant, as I mentioned, canals, without asking who will use this, maintain it, and benefit from it. So yeah, this is just like a snapshot from a research, and I guess Melanie shared links to the paper. So I'm glad to receive any question accordingly. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you so much, Maha. Yes, human-centered design, human-centered adaptation. By design, I think is really the point there. I'm going to ask speakers to be really brief because we only have a few minutes left before we go to the Q&A session, and I want to take some of the questions that have been coming up in the chats, but please add in more questions if you have additional questions for our panelists. Lena, I want to go to you next. As countries are working to kind of translate these global goals into national action. From your view, what is this what are the financing necessities? What are the partnerships or skills that you think we need to be prioritizing? And we've heard a lot about finance today, but just wanted to see if there was more you wanted to add on that.
Thanks a lot, Cristina. And I think this is a really important question, and a question that we will unpack fully, I think, by COP30 in Belém, because when we adopt the GGA, we want to make sure that it actually becomes something that translates to the national and the local level. So from my side, I think first, we need the political will. It needs to remain. It's not a one-time thing, and we need to keep emphasizing that. It's something that we're doing at a ministerial level in LDCs, and it's something that we're trying to push for to be a global political conversation. But in terms of the system, in order for this to work, we need the right support systems. And I think there are three things that I did want to highlight on this point. First, and I will make this point again because it's really important, we need predictable and accessible finance. LDCs and a lot of developing countries know what they need. They know what they need to do to adapt, but they have national adaptation plans, they have local initiatives, they have clear priorities, but they lack the resources to implement them, and they lack the say to actually prioritize. So we need to be able to give them accessible finance, and it needs to be in the forms of grants, not loans. These are a really big deal for a lot of developing countries and least developed countries, because we're sadly constantly repaying debts in our depreciating currencies. It's a loop that we can't get out of. The second thing is, and I think Maha mentioned this a lot, partnerships and people. We need to focus on partnerships that are generally equitable, because international support comes with rigid conditions, and it's usually designed externally. The people it's meant for are never consulted. So we need co-created partnerships, ones that respect local knowledge and ones that build long-term capacity and allow countries to set their own priorities and implementation and implementing instead of implementing the donor agendas. This is really important. And I think finally, I'll just finish by saying we also need to invest in institutional and technical capacities. We cannot just assume countries have the capacities to begin implementing things. So it's whether if it's tracking adaptation progress, which is what we will be doing following the GGA implementation. We also need to make sure that countries have the ability to invest in skills for its people and its staff workers. We need to also make sure that we're not just supporting ministries, we're supporting universities, local governments, civil society, make sure we expand the stakeholders that are needed to actually implement and deliver adaptation. So in short, we need to make sure the finance partnerships and capacity building are delivered, but also focus on how they delivered transparently, inclusively, and building trust in the local leadership. So I'll stop here, but thank you.
Thank you, Lena. A lot packed in there, and echoing, I think, some of the other themes that we've heard about inclusivity by design, but also that equal partnership and equity. Iftikhar, last question for you, and then we'll go to some of the questions we've been receiving in the chat. You work on large infrastructure. We've heard about that, the importance of it for resilience, like irrigation systems in particular, but also you've talked a lot about putting the people at the center of that. How do you do that? Tell us a little bit more about what's needed to do that effectively and efficiently, just in the spirit of learning more from other sectors.
Thank you very much. So I think, as I mentioned, that people needs to be at the center of this endeavor. So some of the things I would suggest is a bottom-up approach, really, and this has been emphasized earlier on. And I think Lena just mentioned it. You really need to get the clear and act on the voices of the people from the ground. So bottom-up approach, that's one. Then you have the community-centered design. You really need to have, and I think Maha very nicely put it, human-centered design. that needs to be done for large irrigation projects and so on, and that is very important. That is the local knowledge. The technology bit is very important. That is critical. You need to use the AIs of the satellite imagery, digital technology. All that needs to be used for the benefit of these big designs, which are human-centered and for the people. And finally, the policies. The policies needs to be in place, the right kind of policies to help that. If you allow me, I just want to spend just 15 seconds on a point because finance has come up quite a bit. 15 seconds. So I think it's important to recognize that we are increasingly facing a very competitive world where financing is becoming scarcer and scarcer. And that we need to recognize. And I think the time of like a free money that is becoming smaller and smaller, that's the reality on the ground. So in order to get out of this thing, we really need to get the help of the private sector. We really need to bring the private sector into the space, take steps to de-risk projects so the private sector can come in. And without the private sector's partnership, we will not have the kind of funding we need to do the global adaptation. Let me just stop there. Thank you.
Well, I want to pick up on that because there's been a couple of questions in the chat relating to finance, and this is open to anyone who wants to come in from our panelists. So, I mean, a point has been made by Jeremy Stone, and nice to see you, Jeremy, on the webinar, about localization, and I think Lena made the point earlier that only 10% gets down to the local level from global climate finance. Is there an opportunity to really activate that locally led, decentralized finance and ensure that money is getting down to the local level and going where it matters? And what more would it take? I mean, we have principles for locally led adaptation that a number of countries and global institutions have signed up to. What more would it take? And then from Rahima, a question about innovative financing mechanisms to achieve these goals. Blended finance for climate resilient agriculture, for example, or insurance, risk transfer mechanisms, impact bonds, pooled funds. I think Lena also mentioned devolved climate funds, just to bring those two together. Where do you, and then Iftikhar, you just mentioned the private sector and how we need to leverage private sector capital resources, capacities, tools, innovation. Where do we see them, where collectively do we see the opportunity to bring the financing down to where it's needed? What more do we need to do, or what do we need to be doing differently? Any thoughts on that front?
If I may come in. So
Yes.
I think what is critical here is to have the first principle, which is we really need to have the local ownership of these endeavors. In other words, locally, at the local level, people should feel that they own a project, they own an initiative, and have mechanisms. And there are plenty of good examples there where there are local revolving funds. You put a seeded money there, they're revolving funds, and they sort of, go around. The money sort of helps the others and so on. But I think for impact, we really need to scale it up. So the impact is not there yet. So I think what is needed is really to have the ownership, to de-risk the projects, to get the private sector in, and to be able to show that some of these projects, there are benefits also for the private sector. Because, for example, in water management, if you get a private sector, I'll not name any company, if the private sector comes in, it is in their interest, if they are in the business where they need water, it is in their interest to make sure that the cost of water is less and it is cost effective, and they are able to use wastewater or reuse water and so on and so forth. So it is in their interest to be able to do that, but it needs to be shown to the private sector and come up with a solution, not unilaterally, but collectively come up with that solution. Let me just stop, and perhaps others can come in also.
Yeah, really interesting points there. Any others want to come in on the financing that's needed?
If I can
Go ahead.
come in, and yeah, maybe at a I think one thing we're missing right now in the global conversation on climate adaptation and finance, and I fully agree with Iftikhar, like the landscape right now for climate finance is getting even more difficult, and access to finance is getting more difficult. Pledges and public funding is difficult. One thing we don't do enough of is talking about private sector in the UNFCCC level, understanding the potential. And this is something, admittedly, these developed countries are wary of as well, because they do see this as a departure from the convention and developed countries providing funding to developing countries. So if we are able to protect that, but also open the space for private funding and the private sector to come and talk about the potential and de-risk and adaptation, making best buys and best cases for adaptation funding, moving away from the thinking that adaptation is charity. I think this is something that we need to unlock at the UNFCCC global level conversation in order for it to actually become to trickle down. It's not there yet. We need to push for it, and I think we need more people actively speaking up for that.
On Lena's point, if I may, Lena, you mentioned about
and then
the
we'll go
private
to Maha.
sector. Yeah. So I think it's also important to recognize that when we talk about private sector, the local national private sector is also equally important. Sometimes when we talk about private sector, we think that it's a global multinational and so on. But there are good private sectors within the country where we can encourage them do exactly the things, Lena, we were talking about, de-risk and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, where there's blended value to be had for both the private sector and the broader
Absolutely.
community. Absolutely. Maha, you wanted to come in on this point.
Yeah, thank you. It's just like based on my work, and particularly maybe in Jordan and most of least developed countries or countries that impacted by climate change, they've been counting mostly on public budget, like public money for infrastructure, having public-private partnership. This is something for some countries isn't new. And the point is, I want to share here is like the capacity of people to write and to access finance. So they still like behind writing a proposal, bankable proposal that they can attract funding. So this is a point where maybe it needs like more attention to build the capacity for the government, the even NGOs, CPOs, even private sector to talk to government. That kind of dialogue that is still need a lot of investment and support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maha. I'm going to try and squeeze in one little question, an additional question in the time we have left. And Dan, this might be for you, but other speakers chime in just briefly. Sorry, my phone just went off. And this is something about, it's about integrating climate with sexual and reproductive health and family planning. What are some of the interlinkages there? Is there any evidence that we can draw from? Are there potential solutions that can be advanced through that angle? Any thought, Dan, or others on this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Cristina. It's actually related to a question that also was just put in the chat about essentially linking climate and climate financing to kind of other dimensions of maternal and child mortality and sanitation needs, for example. So where I have visibility on this and is in the work that we do working with governments. And again, we're often evaluating programs that are operating at a large scale, sometimes nationally, or with large scale NGOs that help on delivery. And they're doing exactly this hard work of trying to bring together. So these are multi-sectoral programs that are trying to improve well-being in several domains, while acknowledging what are the recent critical threats. In some cases, we're working in very fragile places where there's conflict. In other cases, the type of shocks that are coming are increasing extreme weather events due to climate risk. And so these things end up really overlapping because households have to adapt agricultural practices. They have to take on additional adaptation practices while addressing maternal and child nutrition needs, access to family planning, exactly what you're referring to, Cristina. So what we're learning is that multi-sectoral strategies can be very effective. That's a hard lesson sometimes for governments, in part because the evidence can be a bit mixed and can be kind of context driven, or it can kind of vary by context. And yet we're finding that even so, cash transfers are a very powerful tool. And in part, it's a way to kind of get resources out more locally than other large scale development programs. Often through cash transfer programs, the resources get right to households. But we're finding that these are more effective when for climate adaptation and other key priorities that you've mentioned, when it's twinned with these really kind of vital complementary activities or public services around things like nutrition information. It can be around health service delivery that would include family planning. So there's kind of growing evidence on this, and I think really mounting evidence that these kind of well-designed complementary programs can really be effective. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. And that also connects to the financing issue of how do you actually drive
Exactly.
finance
That's
to
it.
the local level really cost effectively. Great points. Does anyone else want to come in on that point? Sort of effective delivery, either through a family planning lens or beyond? Okay, not seeing anyone come off mute there. There was another question that intrigued me about, we've been talking about this from a people-centered lens, but what if from an environmental health lens and a lens of, I'm interpreting a little bit of the question of ecosystem health and planetary health. Would we prioritize different things or approach these things in different ways? I'm just wondering if anyone wants to tackle that question. Would we look at it differently if, in addition to a people-centered focus, we were looking broader at the ecosystem?
Christina, that's a really good question. I think the way I see it is that when we talk about people, it's not just the warm body we are looking at, right? So we're looking at in fact, the person's ecosystem, that's what we're looking at. So included in the people, we are really talking about how the person lives, their environment, how they grow up, what they eat, what health system they will have. So all these are part of the ecosystem of a human being. So we cannot separate the ecosystem from that person we were talking about. And I think everyone pretty much talked about the human face, the human person. So I think I would suggest, I will put to you that it is really one and the same. It is really looking at the human being in the ecosystem, because without the ecosystem, the human being cannot exist. And the ecosystem is there to enable the human to progress and grow.
Super. I can't think of a better place to end with that very succinct and powerful point. I think we covered so many dimensions, but really heard loud and clear themes around human-centered design, holistic approaches, evidence-based approaches, the need to learn from what works, the need to figure out the finance and money where it matters. So great, thank you so much. And gender, I can't forget gender and equity and inclusion, of course. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Tamina to wrap us up, but really want to say thanks to our panelists.
Thanks so much, Cristina. And thank you to everybody for joining us. And a special thanks to our moderator, Cristina, and also to Lena, Dan, Maha, Iftikhar. This was a really rich and fantastic discussion. Before all of you jet off, please hang with me for just a few minutes. I have an ask for you at the end. So I just wanted to say we really appreciated this panelists' thoughtful just interventions and your insights into this. And I'm really hoping that for the audience, it's helped kind of advance your thinking about how we go about implementing global climate commitments. So in case you missed any part of this, a little housekeeping, we are going to be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording. So keep an eye out for that. And please feel free to share the recording with your networks. It would be great to get feedback on that as well. Lastly, or second to lastly, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about GHV and how to work with us, please reach out. You'll see an email address at the bottom of the slide in front of you right now. And then here's my last ask before you jet off. There's going to be a very quick survey that'll pop up on your screen. It's only 4 short questions, but I would really appreciate your feedback so that we can keep improving as we go ahead and do these, continue to do these webinars. And finally, I hope you'll join us for our next webinar in the next few months. We'll send you an email once we finalize the details. And thanks again to our amazing audience and our amazing panelists and moderator. Thank you so much and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.